Welcome back to Disturbed Reality. In 2024, when it comes to real graphic online content, the country of Myanmar has unfortunately produced a lot of gruesome material. While cartels in Mexico and drug factions in Brazil have probably still churned out more of such videos, the content coming out of Myanmar has been especially brutal, with one video in particular released in May of 2024 where 4 men accused of being thieves were ruthlessly executed by a so-called rebel group. It's a video that for me is a contender for the worst quote-unquote gore video to be released in 2024. In recent days, several more graphic videos have emerged from the country, all of which seemingly recorded and released by a variety of different rebel groups across the country. By this point, we have covered several graphic clips from the country of Myanmar, but the theme of said videos has been primarily highlighting the country's military dictatorship and the atrocities in which they have committed on the population. In short, since gaining independence from Great Britain in 1948, Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, has underwent a brutal military dictatorship that lasted from 1962 to 2011. Many hoped that 2011 would be the beginning of a better, freer, and safer Myanmar, though this wasn't the case. After a decade of attempting to implement democratic processes in the country, the military junta once again claims power in Myanmar after overturning the results of the 2020 general election, where the National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, won enough seats to lead Myanmar. Though, the military junta intervened, stating that the vote contained a high number of fraudulent ballots, citing that over 8 million votes showed irregularities. The military junta then took power for themselves and resumed the military dictatorship that previously ended in 2011. The military is led by Min Aung Hlaing, who describes himself as a warrior Buddhist, and under his command, the junta have been accused of crimes against humanity on a massive scale. Like any dictator, he has been accused of shutting down political opposition and dissent with the use of violence and incarceration. The junta has also been accused of ethnic cleansing against minority groups in the country, notably against the Rohingya people. Since the genocide against the Rohingya people began in October of 2016, 750,000 Rohingyans have fled Myanmar, mainly ending up in Bangladesh, in a refugee camp known as the Kutupalong refugee camp. Due to the persecution of the Rohingya people, it has resulted in the Kutupalong becoming the largest refugee camp in the world. The junta have also cracked down on religious freedoms in the country. Muslims, who make up roughly 2.5% of the population and a large part of the Rohingya people, and Christians, who make up around 6% of the population, have also been targeted by the government. The targeting of religious and ethnic minorities in the country has been linked to the military's ideology of Buddhist nationalism. The religion of Buddhism makes up roughly 88% of the population of Myanmar, though Buddhists have also faced the wrath of the military dictatorship, with dissidents speaking out on the treatment of other religions and ethnic minorities being brutally silenced. Buddhists of ethnic minorities have also been targeted by the junta. The accusations of ethnic cleansing have been fueled by the military's use of violence throughout the country, including the rape and pillaging of villages, the burning of villages, as well as a crackdown on freedom of speech and religious expression. Sadly, in 2024, Myanmar is not a topic of discussion among Western media, despite the absolute brutality enacted by the military upon the population, and the abject terror felt by millions of people in the country. Due to the situation in Myanmar, several rebel groups have risen over the years, and have taken the fight to the military junta, causing an increase in violence within the country in the last few years. Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists in many instances have joined together, putting religious ideology aside to fight together to end the military dictatorship. Myanmar is home to numerous ethnic armed organisations, also known as EAOs, that have been involved in protracted conflicts with the central government over issues of autonomy, ethnic rights, and also the control of natural resources. The 3 most powerful rebel groups currently operating in Myanmar are the United Wa State Army, the Arakan Army, and the predominantly Christian Kachin Independence Army. The largest Muslim rebel group in Myanmar are the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. In total, there are estimated to be over 25 armed rebel groups in the country, made up of different ethnic minorities and religious backgrounds. While the rebel groups in Myanmar have been proving effective in fighting against the military junta in the country, with many reports indicating that the junta have lost control over several territories. Sadly, however, some of these groups have also been engaged in fighting each other, creating a free-for-all type environment in many regions across the country. It's also worth stating that several of these rebel groups have also been accused of crimes against humanity and against civilians. One of the most prominent accusations against Myanmar's rebel groups is their exploitation of civilians through forced labour, extortion and abductions. In the territories under their control, some rebel groups impose taxes on local populations, often backed by threats of violence. Civilians are sometimes also coerced into working for these groups without pay, such as constructing infrastructure, carrying supplies, or serving in logistical roles for military operations. In some cases, rebel factions have abducted individuals for ransom or as leverage in negotiations, further destabilizing communities already burdened by conflict. These practices directly undermine the safety and livelihoods of civilians, who are often trapped between the demands of insurgents and the retaliatory actions of government forces. The recruitment and use of child soldiers is another serious crime attributed to rebel groups in Myanmar. Organisations such as the United Wa State Army, UWSA, and the Karen National Liberation Army, KNLA, have been accused of enlisting children into their ranks. These children, some as young as 10, are trained to fight, act as porters, or serve as messengers, often with little regard for their welfare or development. The recruitment of minors violates international laws and conventions, and represents a grim aspect of Myanmar's ongoing conflict, where the most vulnerable bear a disproportionate share of the burden. Drug production and trafficking constitute another major accusation against some rebel groups. Regions like Shan and Kachin states are notorious for their role in the global narcotics trade, with EAOs such as the United Wa State Army and the Shan State Army implicated in the production and distribution of methamphetamine and heroin. These operations provide lucrative funding streams for rebel groups, but come at a significant cost to local communities who face addiction, violence and social breakdown as a result of the drug trade. Furthermore, the profits from narcotics often fuel further violence, perpetuating a vicious cycle of conflict and criminality. Inter-ethnic violence and attacks on civilians are also significant allegations levelled against rebel groups in Myanmar. In areas where multiple factions operate, clashes frequently occur over territory, resources, or ideological differences, with civilians caught in the crossfire. Some groups have been accused of targeting individuals based on their ethnic or religious identities, exasperating Myanmar's already deep divisions. Such violence has led to mass displacements, with thousands of people forced to flee their homes and seek refuge in overcrowded camps or across international borders. While many rebel groups in Myanmar claim to fight for the rights of marginalised communities, the crimes attributed to them undermine their legitimacy and worsen the humanitarian crisis in the country. Civilians, already suffering under the central government's oppressive policies, often find themselves subjected to further harm at the hands of insurgents. Addressing these accusations and holding all parties accountable, rebel groups, government forces, and others, is essential to moving forwards towards peace and justice in Myanmar. In the last week or so, several new graphic videos have emerged from the country, one of which is exceptionally brutal. But nevertheless, let's get into the actual videos. The first two videos in question are seemingly linked to the Arakan army, at least that is what is stated in the video descriptions, though given how complex the situation is in Myanmar, this could possibly be wrong. Aside from the clips being linked to the Arakan army, no other information is available in regards to the videos. The first clip is 1 minute and 20 seconds in length, allegedly perpetrated by the Arakan army. The clip is shot in a rural area, possibly on the outskirts of a village during daytime. In the video, you see 3 captives kneeling on a dirt road. They appear to be 2 women and 1 man. They have all been blindfolded by their captors. They are surrounded by around 10 rebels, possibly more, most of which are armed with bladed weapons. To be exact, they are carrying swords that essentially look like short versions of katanas. Some of the rebels are wearing camo-type jackets. Initially, the rebels kick the captives in the head, and each of the victims crumble to the ground, with the woman, who's wearing the stripy top, appearing to be momentarily knocked out due to the blow. The male captive closest to the camera takes an absolute beating. His head is stomped multiple times by one of the rebels. The other 2 victims are intermittently kicked and stomped. The men can be heard shouting at the captives with complete and utter rage. The woman, who still appears to be knocked out, is then laid out on the ground so that she is face down. A man then stands over her with the sword, but another rebel gets in the way of the camera and you hear a loud thud. The rebel then moves and you see that the woman has been partially decapitated with the sword. Her neck is completely twisted. The man, closest to the screen, also receives the same treatment, but much like is the case with the first victim, you don't get a view of it, but once it's done, the camera pans over to him. He's completely immobilized. The killers then surround the final victim, the woman who is wearing the yellow shirt. She's on her knees and is seemingly instructed to bow her head. One of the men then takes the sword, lifts it over his head, and swings down incredibly hard onto the back of the woman's neck, which instantly cuts through the spine. All 3 victims are now dead, all killed in the same way. At this point, the killers, similar to the old Zeta and Gulf Cartel videos of the early 2010s, then hack and slash the bodies with their swords, hitting the arms, torsos and legs of the victims, causing deep lacerations each time. The swords are ridiculously sharp. The clip ends here. The next video allegedly showcases members of the Arakan army being executed by civilians. The clip is just under 2 minutes in length and is filmed during daytime in the middle of nowhere. You see 2 shirtless victims, both male, and both of whom are kneeling on the ground next to a freshly dug hole meant to be a shallow grave. They look like they have taken a beating prior to recording. They look disheveled and worn out. The captives are kicked and beaten for a while before the mob seemingly deliberate on how to kill them. 2 men then pull out knives that look like daggers and then attempt to simultaneously slit the throats of both captives. The captive on the right of the screen grimaces as the blade slices back and forth across his neck, but it doesn't cut, and he then instinctively tries to get low to the ground to protect himself. The person cutting gives up quickly. The knife is too blunt. The victim furthest away from the camera also receives a similar fate. The would-be killer attempts to slice his throat with the knife. Again, the victim grimaces and makes horrific choking and screeching noises, but again, the blade doesn't cut. The killer tries to slice the throat several more times, and the victim fights for his life, at one point even grabbing the blade with his bare hands. Again, the person trying to perform the violent action fails, and he then hands the blade to someone else. The other man at this point has been thrown into the grave and he's still alive. Somebody kicks the man in the head several times, before then appearing to stab him in the stomach. The other man then has his throat cut. He's laid out on the ground on his stomach. Somebody places his foot on his back whilst lifting his head up via the hair, exposing his throat, and his throat is then finally sliced through with a blade. The men then try to force him into the grave, but he's still fighting with all his might, despite being covered in blood. Multiple men then subdue him, before one plunges the blade deep into his stomach, before then stabbing him multiple times in the chest. All as this happens, the other victim lays motionless in the grave, appearing to have been killed off camera. The video ends as the other victim, who's being stabbed, is still fighting for his life as he's being pushed in the grave. It's safe to assume that both died after the recording. It's fair to say that the first 2 videos were bad. Any videos like this are, but the last is absolutely horrific, easily being one of the worst from Myanmar, and one of the worst quote-unquote gore videos of 2024. The aspect what makes this video especially bad is due to how long the victim managed to cling on to life despite his horrific ordeals, and the sounds that are genuinely unlike anything I've heard before. The video itself is exactly 2 minutes and 50 seconds in length, and it has been filmed at night time on a dirt road. What also makes this clip extra disturbing is that unlike the first two videos, this one is actually very decent quality. Immediately, you are met with brutality. A shirtless man who is gagged and who is wearing a blindfold with his hands tied behind his back instantly has his throat cut with a small but sharp knife. He then falls onto his back and he's laying on the floor. There are multiple men, and you hear them whispering among one another as the victim coughs and chokes on his own blood. You get a horrible close-up of the slash that has been cut into the man's throat, and you see the blood bubbling from the wound. The victim is then turned over onto his stomach, and the rope that is used to tie his hands together is then cut, and the killers then essentially outstretch the man's arms on the ground. One man holds the victim's left arm down while outstretching it, while a person who is carrying a shiny wood splitting axe then proceeds to hack the arm at the elbow. On the first strike, you hear a crunch. After about 5 strikes later, the victim's left arm is partially severed, only being held on by some flesh and ligaments, but the bones look broken. The person with the axe then moves to the victim's right arm, but this time he tries to cut at the shoulder. He hits the shoulder with the axe several times, but it just bounces off, causing horrible thudding sounds each time. He soon gives up, and then moves to targeting the victim's legs and feet. He takes the axe and swings it down several times onto the victim's left ankle, appearing to break it. You hear slight moans of pain from the victim as this happens. The axe-wielding rebel then targets the right leg, hitting down onto the back of the knee, but it doesn't cut. The victim lets out more light groans of pain. The poor captive is then turned back over onto his back, and the killer who cut his throat then takes the knife and stabs down hard into the heart area. The blade plunges deep into the victim's chest, and the captive instinctively covers his wound, and he actually sits up. Despite his already horrific injuries, his groans of pain resemble somebody that has just lightly stubbed his toe or banged his elbow. I think it's possible that he may have been drugged, as his reactions don't match up with the brutality being inflicted upon him. They then force the victim back on the ground, and he instinctively lays in the recovery position. His knees are exposed, and the person with the axe drives the blade down onto the kneecaps several times. After striking the knees with the axe, the killer then once again changes the area of his attack. He now focuses on the head. He takes the axe, but he doesn't use the blade side. Instead, he uses the blunt back of the axe. He strikes the victim hard in the forehead. The back of the axe bounces off his head. The victim lets out a deep groan, so again, the man smashes the victim's forehead with the back of the axe. Another man then moves in, and stabs the victim in the stomach 2 to 3 times. There's so much blood at this point, and somehow, the victim is still conscious. The killers all seem surprised that the captive is still alive. The maniac with the knife then stabs the victim in the Adam's apple area of the neck, before then slashing the blade back and forth across the already deep laceration. This cuts deeper into the captive's neck, and the victim now makes absolutely horrific sounds of laboured breathing, unlike anything I've heard before. The gag that he was previously wearing has slipped down from his mouth, and has essentially got trapped in the laceration in his neck. As he breathes, he makes sounds that resemble that of a buzzing bee or a wasp, but obviously much louder. It's very hard to explain, but it's a high-pitched sound combined with noises of vibration. As I said, it's hard to explain. With the blunt side of the axe, one of the killers then hits the man in the chest several times extremely hard. In doing so, it causes blood to pump out of the stab wound in the heart area. The horrific breathing sounds continue as he is beaten with the blunt side of the axe. You then see two of the killers grab a leg each, and they drag the man down the dirt road for several feet, before then dropping him again. The man with the axe follows, and when they drop the victim, who is still laying on his back, he lines the blunt side of the axe against the top of the victim's head, and he swings the axe like you would if he was making a putt on a golf course. The blunt side of the axe smashes into the top of the victim's head, and I think it cracks his skull. The sound is different to the other axe blows he received to the head. All throughout the video, the men whisper among themselves, as if they are not in a discreet location. Though this doesn't make sense, as in the last segment of the video, as the victim is somehow still alive, you hear the cock of a pistol, before one of the men then shoots the victim in the face, finally ending his suffering. The video ends here. This final clip is one of the most prolonged murders I've seen in quite some time. Surprisingly, the victim barely made a sound in terms of screaming and groaning. However, as mentioned, the sounds of his laboured breathing are absolutely revolting. As for which group perpetrated the murder, I have no idea, but it's easily up there with the worst gore videos released in 2024. But anyway, that is the video. I hope you enjoyed it, if you can enjoy this sort of content. As always, thank you for the support, it's much appreciated. If you want to get in touch, follow me on Twitter, you can drop me a DM with any case recommendations. Also, just to let you know, I do plan on sort of introducing a biographic type of series to the channel where we explore depraved individuals, such as cartel leaders, terrorists, murderers, etc. But I want to do it from a more biographic standpoint, more so than talking about the individual crimes that they committed. Talk about the individual instead. So yeah, I am thinking of bringing a biographic type of series to the channel. Like, one of the working titles I had in mind was like The Real Faces of Death or The True Faces of Death, something along those lines. But if you guys have any ideas or any suggestions, please do let me know. But anyway, guys, I'm going to wrap it up here. As always, stay safe, and I'll catch you on the next one.